It's been a while since we had a proper historical episode on the show, and I've missed them. So, to celebrate a return to the past, I'm going to take you back further than ever before, almost 2,000 years to be precise, to the days of the Roman Empire. This week, we're going to be talking about Incitatus, the horse who, it's often said, became a consul. To most people, the name Incitatus probably doesn't mean much, but if you elaborate to include the fact that he was Emperor Caligula's favourite horse, there might be a spark of recognition there. Certainly to anyone who, like me, grew up watching and reading horrible histories. The commonly told story of Incitatus goes as follows: that Caligula was a cruel and insane ruler of Rome, who went so mad that he made his favourite horse a consul, pretty much the highest position there was in the empire. Some retellings will even go as far as to say that it was this that led directly to Caligula's assassination, that the Roman people realised he'd finally lost the plot and gone too far and took matters into their own hands to get rid of him. But how much truth really is there in that story? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today. Usually in this show, I like to talk about the animals we feature as individuals, to tell you about what they were like, their personalities and quirks, sharing cute anecdotes from those who knew them. You all know by now that I'm passionate about celebrating animals as the unique individuals they are, but in this case that's not really possible, which I suppose isn't surprising given that this all happened almost 2,000 years ago. What I do know about Incitatus is that he was a white stallion, although he should technically be described as grey if you want to be a super pretentious nitpicky horse nerd about it, which I apparently do, and that he was a successful racehorse. His name literally means fast moving. When you picture horse racing, you probably think of the sport in its modern context, an ethically questionable activity where tiny jockeys with practically non-existent stirrup leathers push young thoroughbreds to cover either a short distance of flat ground or a longer distance with fake hedges to jump. But in ancient Rome, horse racing was a very different affair. For a start, the horses weren't ridden. Instead, they would pull chariots, usually in pairs or teams. Chariot racing was an incredibly popular sport in ancient Rome, and also in ancient Greece, where it was practiced since at least the 13th century BCE and was also a mainstay in the original Olympics. While there is a definite through line between ancient chariot races and modern horse racing, there is a more direct descendant too in the form of harness racing, which is still an actively ongoing sport, although it's nowhere near as popular or widespread as typical ridden racing. Modern horse racing has a lot more in common with ancient chariot racing than you might expect. For a start, it was a very dangerous sport for both the horses and their drivers. I'm sure you can imagine the carnage of those high-speed crashes. And like modern racing, which is often referred to as the sport of kings due to the obscene wealth involved, chariot racing was also incredibly popular with the aristocracy of the time. Owning skilled racehorses was a status symbol, and of course owners would make a big deal of their most successful animals, although none took it as far as Caligula. Like many horses in ancient Rome, Incitatus was from what is now modern-day Spain. These Spanish horses were the favourite of the Roman elite, with an estimated 10,000 horses being imported to Rome each year. Spanish horses were prized for their beauty and size, and for the speed, courage and strength they displayed both in chariot racing and as cavalry mounts. And this is another thing that we still see echoes of today. Spain and its surrounding countries still produce what are considered to be some of the most beautiful, noble and majestic horse breeds that there are. And like Incitatus, many Spanish horses are still greys who swiftly fade to a beautiful pure white. We can probably assume that Incitatus didn't look too different from a modern-day grey Andalusian stallion, if you want to have an idea of what to picture him as. We don't really know all that much about Incitatus' life. We don't know how Caligula came to acquire him or when they first met. I don't think we even know much at all about his racing career beyond the fact that he was apparently very successful. What we do know, though, is that Caligula absolutely adored Incitatus. And not just in the normal way a horse owner might love their pet, this was so extra. Do people still say extra? Is that still a thing? I'm so out of the loop with online slang these days. For a start, Incitatus of course couldn't be housed in any old stable made from bricks or wood. That was for normal horses, and clearly Incitatus was superior to them in every possible way. So his stable was constructed from solid marble. His diet consisted of hay served to him in a manger made of ivory, because wood was far too common. And clearly Incitatus was more important than the elephants who'd been killed for their tusks. And if he found himself growing bored of his hay, then he could instead dine on his other staple, oats mixed with flakes of gold. Real gold. You can actually eat little bits of gold like that, it's not going to hurt you, but it is going to pass through your system undigested. Just think of the sparkly manure this horse must have been producing. And, oh, you thought a marble stable and an ivory manger were enough for the finest horse in all of Rome? You fool! Of course, Incitatus needed a house and gardens of his own, which was so fancy it was sometimes even described as a palace. And of course his home just had to be decorated with the finest furniture and staffed by 18 servants who waited on him hand and foot. Or hoof and hoof, I should probably say. What's that you're asking yourself? What would a horse even need an elaborately furnished palatial home for? Well, obviously he needed to host dinner parties for nobility. I mean, Caligula was the one who handled the admin side of Incitatus' parties, sending out the invites and telling the servants what food to prepare and all of that, but he was always very insistent that it was indeed Incitatus who was the host. And Jupiter help you if you dared question the logic of all this. Caligula was known to be an emperor who was more than willing to execute his nobles if they didn't play along with his whims, no matter how outlandish or divorced from reality they may have been. A lot of Roman emperors were known to be a little quirky, but Caligula took that to a whole new level. And the only thing that seemed to surpass his eccentricities was his cruelty. Again, a lot of emperors were unnecessarily cruel and ruthless, but if accounts of Caligula's exploits are to be believed, then he was nothing short of evil, and that's not a word I use lightly. Like, a lot of the stuff he's described as having done are so horrific that I don't even want to include them in this episode, because they're just so twisted. This isn't a guy who was ruthless to his enemies, this is someone who was actively sadistic, who revelled in torturing others. A lot of Caligula's weirder decisions are probably some of his best known, like the whole thing with Incitatus. So it was kind of a punch in the face to be reading about that, and then suddenly get hit with the accounts of some of his most abhorrent acts. Researching for this episode gave me emotional whiplash like nothing else on this show so far, and I'm going to spare you from that. Weirdly, when Caligula first came to power in 37 AD, he was welcomed by the Roman people as a breath of fresh air. Someone who seemed to be much more rational and compassionate than his predecessor, Emperor Tiberius, who'd come to be seen as something of a tyrant. And initially, Caligula seemed to live up to those expectations. He was, by all accounts, a good ruler, beloved by his subjects. And then, after only a few months of ruling, he became ill. So severely ill that he nearly didn't survive. And although he did live, it seemed almost as if a part of him had died. For whatever reason, after his illness, he changed. He became cruel and tyrannical, obsessed with his own power and ego. He declared himself to be a god and would literally walk around cosplaying as whichever Roman deity took his fancy. Caligula had a temple and priests dedicated to him. In fact, Cassius Dio claims that Caligula even made a horse one of his personal priests. He doesn't name the horse, but I think it's a fair assumption that if this did happen, then that horse would certainly have been Incitatus. Caligula would don a thunderbolt and golden beard if he wanted to show himself as Jupiter, king of the gods. If he wanted to pass himself off as Neptune, god of the sea, he'd wield a trident. If he found himself vibing more with Mercury, god of commerce, communication and trickery, he'd walk around with a staff entwined with serpents. I assume they weren't actual live snakes, but honestly with Caligula I wouldn't even be surprised if they were. And it wasn't just the male deities. He was also known to dress up in a woman's gown to embody Venus, the goddess of beauty. And you know someone's a truly awful person when I can't even get excited about them cross-dressing. Like, that's usually one of my favourite things. And it wasn't just Caligula who had a dressing up box full of goodies. Incitatus also had a whole wardrobe of only the finest attack. Yeah, remember Incitatus? Remember when this episode was about him and not his awful owner? Let's get back to that. As far as Caligula was concerned, Incitatus was first among horses, among all beings other than himself, so of course Incitatus' dress had to reflect this. He was adorned in purple blankets. Purple, of course, being the most expensive and rare colour of fabric available at this time, the colour of Roman royalty. Caligula was very big on being seen as a king, a major taboo in ancient Rome who had long since overthrown their monarchy. The emperors were, realistically speaking, not all that different from kings, but most of them knew better than to openly identify as such because of the backlash it would bring from the public. But as we've established, Caligula couldn't care less about the opinions or approval of anyone other than himself. And gorgeous purple blankets weren't the only finery Incitatus would be adorned with. His tack and harnesses were adorned with jewels, rare and precious gemstones, an ostentatious display of his master's wealth and lavish spending. Nothing was too good for Rome's greatest racehorse. We don't actually know if Incitatus was the best racehorse in all of the Roman Empire. What we do know is that no one would have been foolish enough to question Caligula's opinion that he was. I found one claim that when Incitatus lost a race, Caligula ordered for the groom to be executed in the slowest and most painful way possible as punishment, because of course it couldn't have been Incitatus' fault. But of course, there's one thing that's gone down in history as the embodiment of Caligula's so-called madness, of just how self-important and detached from reality he truly was, and that's when he awarded Incitatus a consulship. There was a time during the years of the Roman Republic that consuls were the highest political power there was. However, by the time of the Empire, the consul had been reduced to more or less an honorary role. With the emperor now the supreme leader, the consuls are robbed of much of their power, because who needs democracy? But the title of consul remained, and was still a high-ranking position to have, even if they didn't really do much. An emperor naming their friends, allies and relatives as consuls was not at all unusual. But a horse? That was unheard of, unprecedented. And also untrue. It didn't happen. Caligula never made his horse a consul. The idea that he did is at best a misunderstanding and at worst an outright lie. So what actually happened? Well, if you believe the accounts of Suetonius, an ancient Roman historian and biographer, he certainly wanted to. He talked about it and fully intended to. The only thing that stopped him was that he was assassinated before he could go through with it by guards who were frankly fed up of his cruelty and downright weirdness. In fact, it's been alleged that Caligula's attempt to have Incitatus made a consul was one of the things that led to his guards' rebellion, the straw that broke the camel's back. So that's the truth of the matter, right? Caligula finally became so insane that he tried to make his horse a consul and was finally overthrown after 4 short, bloodthirsty years ruling Rome. Well, that's how it's often been reported. That's how actual Roman historians said it happened. But, well, would you be angry if I told you that's also possibly not true? I hope not, because I'm telling you that now. It's possibly not true. At the very least, it's likely to be an exaggeration. Reports of the whole consul debacle do indeed come from actual ancient Romans like Cassius Dio and Suetonius, both early examples of historians, but that's kind of the problem. As much as we may like to view it that way, history is not a series of objectively true facts, devoid of bias or agenda. It's a living, evolving thing that changes depending both on who records it and on who then interprets it. I know the line, "history is written by the victors," is kind of a cliche at this point, but it's true. Oftentimes, especially in the past, history was recorded by those in power in whatever way best served their beliefs. Oppressors would choose to leave out or erase the identities and lives of those they victimised in a way that's still felt today by those of us who are marginalised by society. And the malleability of history has to be taken into account when we look at the surviving records of Caligula and Incitatus. We can't just repeat the works of Roman historians without taking into consideration the fact that their writing probably would have been affected by the political climate of the time. Intentionally or not, they may well have exaggerated or indeed even made up some of the wilder claims about Caligula's reign for their own ends. And even aside from that, they weren't writing until decades after Caligula's assassination. Most of what they recorded could well have just been rumours and urban legends, tales passed from one person to another, changing slightly each time, becoming more outlandish because, frankly, it made for a better story. It's not impossible that some people even made up their own stories to add into the mix, and over time they just became accepted as fact. So, what, none of this is true? Well, not necessarily. It is indeed possible that Caligula openly considered making Incitatus a consul, and that could indeed have been a sign of his deteriorating mental state, a decision he came to because he genuinely believed that Incitatus would shine in such a role. That's the narrative Suetonius wanted to put forward certainly, and that could be what happened. But even if we're to assume that Caligula did want to make Incitatus a consul, that doesn't mean that that was the reason. It's also just possible that he wanted to give Incitatus a consulship because he loved his horse and wanted to celebrate him. I mean, people anthropomorphise their favourite pets all the time. I'm certainly not innocent of this myself. But when the owner is rich, that can go to a whole different level. Just think of the people who buy their dogs designer clothes, or throw them elaborate weddings, or build them doghouses designed to look like mini human mansions. The animals have no concept of what any of this means, they can't appreciate it. But it's not really done for them, it's done by the owner for the owner. And maybe this was just an extreme example of that. After all, whatever you can say about Caligula, and oh my god, is there a lot to say, he clearly adored Incitatus. Another theory that's been put forward, which I think is the one that I most believe, is that while yes, Caligula did propose making Incitatus a consul, he wasn't being serious. One example of this is that he could have done it as a way of insulting the consulate, implying that they were all so useless that an animal could have done a better job. Or it could be perceived as yet another example of Caligula's love of abusing his own power, to show that he could put a horse in one of the highest positions there was in the empire and no one could stop him. He could do whatever he wanted and no one had the power to do anything about it, no matter how weird, how pointless, how harmful it may be. Suetonius presents the Incitatus thing as something that Caligula was serious about, something that he fully intended to follow through on, but it's entirely possible that the root of all of this was Caligula making an offhand comment or joke for either of those two reasons. It could be something he said just once in passing that then turned into a game of broken telephone in the decades following. And one thing we do know is that Suetonius tended to be uncharitable in his interpretation of Caligula's actions. For example, he recounts a time when Caligula had his soldiers line up on the beaches of modern-day France. It was naturally assumed that he was intending to cross the Channel and invade Britain. And yet, when he gave his order, it wasn't to launch a battle. Instead, he told his soldiers to collect seashells. And of course they did, because no one would dare question the emperor. They walked up and down the shoreline, filling their helmets and tunics with shells, which Caligula then declared to be the spoils of victory against the sea? However, Natasha Sheldon recounts in her article for History Collection that the Roman word for seashell was also used by soldiers as a slang term for an engineer's hut, So the truth may well have been that Caligula actually ordered his men to clear the beach of military installations. And while I'm certainly no defender of Caligula, the man was clearly an awful human being, that certainly seems like a more logical interpretation than the idea that he was trying to start a war against the actual sea. Which, again, comes back to what I said earlier about the importance of questioning retellings of history, and viewing it as a whole with as much context as possible, rather than just accepting things at face value. We'll never know just how much of the Incitatus drama actually happened, and how much of it was born from decades of myth-building. But regardless, it's certainly gone down in history as one of the most bizarre things a Roman emperor did, which is really saying something because those guys were weird. As so much of history does, it can also serve as a lesson for the present, a warning against allowing people to rule who are motivated entirely by their own ego and self-interest. People who seek power not because they want to help people, but to fuel their own self-importance, and frankly sadism against those they view as inferior. A theme that feels particularly pertinent now given the upcoming US election. And I'm sure there's also a link I could make between inaccurate, biased historical records and the AI deepfakes that are being spread. But to be honest, I don't have the mental bandwidth for that right now, so someone more articulate than me will have to handle that. Caligula was not a democratically elected ruler, but that doesn't mean that a ruler voted for by the public wouldn't commit similar atrocities and seek dictatorship if enough good people didn't vote to prevent it. I really want to end this episode on a lighter note than the horrifying rise of American Christofascism, so isn't it funny that the silly mad emperor man made his horse a senator? What a funny silly story that exists in total isolation from everything else, and has no parallels to our modern world. What a fun light-hearted episode this is! Don't think too hard about it! But seriously, wherever you live, please never skip on an opportunity to vote. Our democracy is only guaranteed if we use it, and our human rights can only be protected if we work to defeat those who seek to overthrow them. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. I know this one was a little different from normal and probably won't perform as well because of it, but oh well. It's fun to try new things. I get bored if I do the same formula too many times. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way you can. Subscribe, share it, leave a review, anything like that. It all really does help. New episodes come out every single Tuesday, plus bonus minisodes at least once a month, and yeah, I think that's everything for this week. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!